various media and political actors turn natural and social disasters, mega fires or mass shootings, into isolated incidents, which allows societies to deny systematic problems. American police killings are one example. And when a bad apple can be found, like Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd last year, he will be punished with a vengeance. Bad apple theory keeps structural analysis at bay in policing, housing, climate change, international relations, university funding shortfalls, you name it. The difference between isolated problems and deep structural forces has become a fault line between the political right and left, and the fault line has become an epistemic abyss. For example, the right has recently cast critical race theory, though somewhere between 30 and 40 years old as theory, as a novel slander of US and UK history, precisely because CRT analyzes racism as a constitutive social and economic force and not as a matter of individual apples. This abyss certainly runs through interpretations of British colonial history and practice, and it is one that Deana Heath looks into directly. Her book aims, she writes early on, to demonstrate that extraordinary violence was part of the ordinary operation of colonial states. The violence she studies comes from the police, largely staffed with Indians. Among the many qualities of this book that impressed me was its unblinking confrontations with the binary contrasts we in the West are taught to use to detect the virtues of our political systems. There's the contrast between law and violence, between democracy and executive power, between discipline and sovereignty, and between exceptional and ordinary forms of social coercion. Dr. Heath's research obliges us to confront the prospect that terror was central to the operation of colonial systems of rule, and that further, colonial rule is central to the constitution of Anglo-democracy in Britain and elsewhere. Such conclusions produce sometimes well-organized public resistance, placing the burden of proof on the scholar who claims that an abusive or violent act is constitutive rather than isolated. Dr. Heath's book offers heroic levels of empirical documentation of her claim about the systemic nature of violence and terror. She also asks us to confront the systemic nature of the failure of police reform, an issue still very much in the news. Her work deeply disrupts the stories we seek to tell about how we have overcome the violent or racist sources of our global positioning in order to tell stories that are both more accurate and more effective in the world, which are two things that I think this book succeeds in doing. Before I turn it over to Dr. Heath, I'll remind us again of our context this afternoon. This is the ISRF's 10th launch of books written by our fellows. They are distinctively pluridisciplinary, by which I mean they get at underlying structures treated by fields like psychology or critical theory that are sometimes missed or separated off by the orthodox social sciences. These overlooked structures often involve an inner difficulty, and Dr. Heath's inquiry into the outlook of the perpetrators of violence is exemplary. There are interesting synergies among the fellows' projects. We've launched 3 books on the failure of democracies actually to democratize their societies. Annalene Dedang's History of Freedom, Oche Onazi on Ubuntu as an African Path Toward Disability Justice, and Kimberly Brownlee on how we ignore the philosophical priority of social rights to individual rights. We've launched 3 books on the failure of prominent efforts to suppress war, Kean O'Driscoll on the failings of just war theory, Craig Jones on the war lawyering that makes continuous war more, not less likely in the American and Israeli armed forces, and Catherine Charrette's research on why the European Union failed to recognize Hamas after their 2006 election victory in Gaza. We've launched 2 books on how mainstream economics damages both society and the planet as it operates in anti-democratic modes controlled by specific interests. There was Gabor Shearing's book on Hungarian leader Viktor Orban's creation of an authoritarian accumulative state, and Peter Newell's book on how to break the grip of the fossil fuel complex over energy policy, which, as we speak, of course, is still very much unbroken. Dr. Heath follows our launch 2 weeks ago of Alessandro Gribaldo's Unexpected Subjects, which offers an anthropology of the Italian courts, as they often fail to translate the subjectivity of women who have undergone domestic violence into usable legal evidence on their behalf. So Dr. Heath today explores a similar systemic gap between legal and political theory on the one hand and police practice on the other. Although as a group, our fellows certainly disagree on various things. As a group, they have been exploring the disconnect between the worlds we say we want and the worlds created by the systems we construct. And it feels to me that this body of research both articulates this gap in new ways and generates ideas about how we might close it. Okay, so as Lars mentioned, we'll start with Dr. Heath's overview of her book, which will run 10 or 15 minutes. Then we will proceed with our commentators, Professor Stephen Legg, coming to us from Nottingham, England, and then from Professor Ranabir Samadar, coming in from Kolkata, I believe. Dr. Heath may want to reply, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I'm going to introduce our speakers one at a time. First, Deana Heath received her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, has taught at institutions in the US, Ireland, and Canada, and held research fellowships in India and Australia before joining the University of Liverpool in 2013. Her first book was Purifying Empire, Obscenity and the Politics of Moral Regulation in Britain, India, and Australia. It came out with Cambridge University Press in 2010. And it showed how the drive to regulate obscenity in late 19th century Britain was transformed from a national into a global and imperial project to very different effects in two colonial contexts, India and Australia. Her research took her to a huge number of archives in an effort that shows me, and it's my editorial here, what humanities scholarship can achieve when it is properly funded, which is all too rare. More recently, Dr. Heath's research into the history of violence resulted in a co-edited book, Communalism and Globalization in South Asia and its Diaspora, out with Routledge in 2011. And this led to her ISRF-funded project, Colonial Terror, Torture, Violence, and the Unmaking of the World. Deana, it's really a pleasure to have you with us.
So I'd just like to begin by thanking the ISRF, not just for hosting this book launch and for providing me with a year's funding, but for the ongoing interdisciplinary discussion and dialogue I've been privy to through them, particularly in regard to violence and how we theorize it. And one of the most fantastic things about the ISRF, which I really love as a former fellow, is that it creates a real sense of community, which it does in part through continuing to engage with former fellows in a variety of ways. And this has played an important role for me in spurring the ideas for this book. And I'd like to thank all of you in addition, particularly Steve and Ranabir, for joining us for an event like this at a time of year which, well, there are better things we could all be doing than talking about colonial torture. So to turn then to colonial terror, I'd like to start by talking about its genesis, which began less with questions about the nature of colonial violence than the nature of the colonial archive, specifically the National Archives of India in New Delhi, because it was there that I first encountered the word torture in the large bound indexes produced by the British for their many archival series, their legislative, judicial, policing series, and so on. And I was very struck by the appearance of this word torture for a number of reasons, not least that as colonial regimes have little interest in the welfare of colonized peoples, particularly in regard to the violence they inflict on each other. Why, I wondered, would the British colonial regime in India have been monitoring issues to do with torture? What purpose, in addition, did the concept of torture serve for such a regime? Why, furthermore, did torture appear to be such a persistent problem for the colonial regime? Since the term, as I went on to discover, appeared in colonial indexes and other documents with surprising regularity from the early 19th century onwards. And why, moreover, had torture in colonial India attracted so little attention from scholars, barring largely a small body of work on the 1854 Madras Torture Commission, which doesn't really question why on earth a colonial regime would do something that strikes me as utterly astonishing, and that is to set up a commission to examine its own violence and rapacity. This is something to me that we had to question. And what finally did colonial torture reveal about the nature of colonial violence more generally? So these then were the questions that I set out to answer. And I have to confess that it has taken me a long time to attempt to answer them, in part because they required an interrogation of a diverse array of scholarship on issues to do with things like violence, the archive, policing, law, the state, sovereignty, terror, pain, suffering, and trauma, gendered violence, and of course, torture. A bigger challenge was figuring out how to theorize torture in colonial India, particularly since I sought to understand torture as part of the broader repertoire of colonial violence. The task I set myself then was the rather modest, but to me important one, which is why I devoted a whole chapter of the book to it, of attempting to theorize the nature and operation of colonial violence. To turn then to how I answered these questions in the book, I'll start with those in relation to the British colonial regime's monitoring of torture in India, what purpose the concept of torture served, and why it was a persistent problem for the British. The answer to all of these questions can, I think, be summed up by Robert Young's definition of colonial torture, which is the violence of the state secreted out of sight, which it claims not to authorize in order to exercise its power over the bodies of its subjects and the space of its occupied territory. In other words, there was nothing remotely exceptional or aberrational about torture in colonial India. It was instead a quotidian aspect of the structural violence of the colonial state. But as it was impossible for such a state to acknowledge the constitutive role of such violence to the maintenance of its rule, it had to repeatedly deny its culpability for systemic torture and make endless attempts to appear to eradicate it by displacing the blame for it onto what I have termed, in a rethinking of the nature of colonial policing, its violence workers, namely the subordinate members of its police forces. And I just want to briefly mention this image that I'm showing here, because it's the only one I have found that actually depicts torture taking place. Actually, the man in this image, who I've faded out of respect for the victim here, was dead at the time this was taken, presumably tortured to death. What I find by colonial police forces, although this particular image was taken in Burma, but then governed as part of British India, what I find really, really striking and disturbing about this image is the two British officers looking on. And it's a powerful image for me because the British repeatedly, endlessly denied that they knew anything about or had anything to do with torture. In fact, they repeatedly denied after the Madras Torture Commission that torture no longer existed in India, despite the fact that they were obsessively, seemingly trying to eradicate it and talking about it and so on. So this image belies the notion that the British knew absolutely nothing about the torture that their police were enacting. So according to the British then, it was the uncivilized, atavistic nature of their police forces in India that were responsible for torture, not Britain's colonial system of rule. But such a narrative, while incredibly enduring, began to buckle by the early 20th century in the face of the first major scandal since the Torture Commission. And it was in response to that that the British strove to make torture in colonial India simply disappear, quite literally by a linguistic sleight of hand, by renaming it mistreatment. So the word torture actually disappears from all those colonial indexes I was talking about. It begins to do so around 1914 and was actually abolished as a term that could be used in 1917. And I've mentioned the Indian police. And of course, I call the book Colonial Terror because I'm trying to hit home the point about the nature of this police force. You know, I've referred to them as violence workers. And as I argue in the book, the key role of these violence workers was to terrorize a colonized people, to keep them oppressed. And so, you know, these quotes capture the nature of this policing system. They were a terror to young and old alike, an engine of oppression of the most exquisite and pernicious kind. And for some critics, they were a means of transforming India into the policeman's kingdom. In other words, India was a police state. These, by the way, all refer to the so-called New Indian Police that was purportedly invented post-1860. If you read reams of stuff on the Indian Police, you know, it was all supposedly transformed, etc. And well, no, it was pretty much the same police force that it had always been. Now, as to why torture in colonial India, or indeed in other colonial contexts, has attracted so little attention from scholars, barring as a means of, as the colonizers put it, in a term I find very problematic, counterinsurgency, this is because I think we still view colonialism in contexts such as India in many ways far too benignly, which is a product in part of the way in which violence continues to be understood, namely as an act committed by identifiable individuals against other identifiable individuals. This form of violence, which Slavoj Žižek terms objective violence, is the most visible form, and it explains why when scholars study colonial violence, they tend to focus on events like genocide or massacres, you know, very public, visible displays of violence. But as Žižek also notes, such forms of violence are only the visible manifestations of other forms, such as structural or symbolic violence. So it is these forms of violence that we need to study in order to make sense of the nature of colonial violence. So it was to challenge conceptions of British rule in India as relatively benign that I organized the chapters of Colonial Terror according to the ways in which torture was facilitated and perpetrated, and that I strove to reassess both the nature of colonial policing, as I've already suggested, but also the nature of colonial law, not least through debunking the persistent myth that British colonialism in India operated through a rule of law. That myth has been touted out recently during all the Brexit discussions and so on. Indeed, rather than serving as a check on torture by the colonial state's violence workers, the judicial system in colonial India, as the book demonstrates, served instead to facilitate it. In terms, lastly, as to what colonial torture reveals about the nature of colonial violence, I won't torture all of you here by going into depth about my theoretical arguments in the book, which draw heavily upon Giorgio Agamben's work on states of exception and Michel Foucault's on governmentality, apart from saying that I argue that we should view the British colonial state in India as a regime of exception in which two levels of extraordinarity coexisted. And I derive this concept, by the way, from Santanu Kanika's stellar book on state violence in post-colonial India, which is called State Violence and Legitimacy in India. One level was a state or spaces of exception wrought by widespread emergency regulations, and the other what Didier Fassin terms petty states of exception generated by colonial officials, such as the police, acting as petty sovereigns. And it was in such a regime, the book argues, it was such a regime that generated the conditions in which not only torture, but other forms of violence could flourish in colonial India. And I'll leave my bit there.
Dana, thank you very much. Let's turn to our commentators. And I just want to remind folks that you're also welcome to put questions in the Q&A box at any point, and we will forward these as we go. Stephen Legg is our first commentator. He is a professor of historical geography at the University of Nottingham. He took his degree, his doctorate, and then held a junior research fellowship at the University of Cambridge before joining the University of Nottingham in 2005. His research centers on the geographies of late colonialism, with a particular focus on British-Indian relations in the interwar period. He has studied New Delhi as the capital of the Raj, the end of tolerated Indian red light brothel zones in the 1920s, and London as a conference city for Indian delegates in the early 1930s. He has also explored Indian internationalism via the League of Nations, central provincial relations in the Indian Constitution, and the ways women in Delhi negotiated the boundary between public and private space. He is the editor with Deana Heath of South Asian Governmentalities, Michel Foucault and the Question of Post-Colonial Ordering, which came out with Cambridge in 2018. He is also an ISRF Mid-Career Fellow for 2021-22, working on mapping a pre-partition city, the communal geographies of late colonial Delhi. Stephen, it's great to have you with us.
We've been asked to speak for about 5 minutes or so to leave time for discussion. There's so much to say about this fantastic book. I have worked with Deana for a while, so I was expecting this to be a book about torture, but as you'll see from the title, it's actually much more than that, and I think much more interesting than that. It's a book about colonial terror, subtitled Torture and State Violence in Colonial India. And what I think it does brilliantly is shows how richly and in really complicated and detailed ways torture and state violence in colonial India were intersected. And it faces up to a series of really broad political, but also, I think, interpretative challenges, not least of which how to acknowledge that most of the perpetrators of torture in India that we can know about were Indians. And there's a fantastic quote which Deana uses halfway through, where she talks, a quote from Frantz Fanon, about paraphrasing the way in which colonial violence became settled in the bones of colonial subjects against each other. That's just one of the many brilliant questions which Deana takes up in this book. There's so many things to praise. I never ever praise footnotes. In general, when I see massive footnotes, my heart sinks. I don't need to know, if you use the word sociology, that there was someone called Durkheim. But practically every footnote here brought us something in terms of acknowledgement of the broad scholarship Deana's engaged with. But there's also generosity of acknowledgement here in the footnotes. It helps the reader, but it also acknowledges the depths. And having done that, moves on to make a really impressive series of interventions. The structure of the book is fascinating. 2 large chapters on facilitators, the police, and law and justice, and then a chapter on perpetrators. And through this work, Deana makes the case for us to think not just of states or spaces of exceptionalism, but of regimes which combine moments and spaces of exception in the emergency, but also get us to think about those everyday petty sovereigns that could execute these forms of torture. And there's also a really nice historical point which Deana makes at the start, which is that late colonial violence against anti-colonial nationalism in the 20th century only looks especially violent if you're not aware of how violent the 19th and early 20th century was. And this book does a lot to help us pivot our perceptions of that presumed sort of century-based distinction. I'm here to sort of raise questions. So there's 3 I'd like to pose to Deana. One's about definitions, one's about subaltern experience, and one's about psychology. And I say this in a mode of autocritique as a sort of Foucauldian who has issues with his failings in terms of psychological explanation. So firstly, definition. The question, not so much what does torture mean, but when did people define what torture was, and what do we do with that? An interesting definition is given from an unpublished document by Jeremy Bentham, which is that torture is the use of pain to compel someone to start or to stop something. So my question is not really, does that definition apply across time and space? My question is more, at what point did something become torture? When did people apply the term? And what happens when we use that categorization? So what happens if we allow torture to slip from a categorization of a form of violence into a thing? So at various points in the book, and we hear that people were tortured to death. Whenever I hear that, my question is, well, what did that entail? And at what point did it become torture? And what do we perpetuate by continuing to describe things as torture? That is, torture as object, not torture as category. The second question is about subaltern experience. I've mentioned the structure of the book, facilitators, perpetrators. There isn't a final chapter on subjects or objects or victims of torture. And I suppose my question is why? In other of Deana's publications, there are more descriptions of the actual acts of torture which are mentioned in the archive. So my question is, I suppose, why isn't there that chapter? Was it considered? And is it an ethical decision that you make, just as you faded out that photograph that you opened up with? Is it an ethical decision not to describe torture because that perpetuates the violence and victimizes these subjects again? So I was constantly wanting a bit more detail about torture. So we think of it as a thing, not a category or an object, but at the same time, I think there's an ethical reason for us to not perpetuate that violence by continually redescribing it. And my third point is about psychology. Foucault is circulating throughout this book, and he was obviously famously skeptical of the sciences, but there is only so far Foucault can take us in terms of psychological depth. I think in his latter work, he moved beyond just thinking about subjectivization to thinking about relations to self, but the internal complexity which his work gives us is, I think, quite limited. So how do we explain why some people became torturers? The chapter on perpetrators gives us a whole series of factors which people who tortured often had in common in terms of perhaps caste or experience or being underpaid. But you could line up tens of thousands of people in those subject positions and not all of them would be willing to torture. Deana says that she does not want to categorize these people as sadists. But for me, I think that question still remains unanswered. What can we do retrospectively? Can we psychoanalyze subjects? Can we use psychodynamic theories? How far would we be willing to go? Even if it's not just saying sadists, if it's saying something a bit more complex. So that's autocritique, really. When does Foucault stop being enough? And what might we do to take us beyond the limiting, I think, capacities for Foucauldian explanations in terms of subjectivity and subject relations? But again, these are fascinating questions that I would never have come to without this book. So get the book, read the book, and thank you very much, Deana, for writing it.
Stephen, thank you very much. Our next and final commentator is Professor Ranabir Samadar, who is the director of the Calcutta Research Group. He has worked extensively on issues of justice and rights in the context of conflicts in South Asia, on post-colonial theory, on the relationship between post-colonial theory and other bodies of thought, including Marxist political economy. His many books include The Politics of Dialogue, which came out with Ashgate in 2004, a 3-volume study of Indian nationalism, Whose Asia Is It Anyway? Nation and the Region in South Asia, 1996, second volume, The Marginal Nation, Trans-Border Migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal in 99, and a biography of the Indian nation, 1947 to 1997, which came out in 2001. His other political writings were published in various places, including in an Anthem Press collection of 2007 called The Materiality of Politics, as well as another collection called The Emergence of the Political Subject. His work in general challenges prevailing accounts of the birth of nationalism in the nation state and focuses on shifting the parameters of critical post-colonial thinking, among many other things. Professor Samadar, it's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, and my thanks to the organizers, the ISRF, and particular thanks to Deana Heath for writing the book. I read it closely, and I have learned a lot. And I must admit that that I'm not a historian, and therefore some of the material was familiar, but as I said, I learned a lot, and some of it was unfamiliar. But I chose to read the book, or as I was reading the book, I thought that perhaps there is another framework to view the material that she has presented, so densely, and for the of all of us. So while, as everyone has admitted, and I admit that I have learned a lot, But I also, given my own position as someone who looks much more closely at the present time and in that interest looks at the past. So what I want to do in this 5-7 minutes to push the material and the framework that she has presented a little farther and suggest that possibly we may, look at this whole question of colonial terror in a different angle. Very briefly speaking, my dispute is with the whole framework of exception. And as I read the book and I was trying to read other material, whatever little I had written, and I was struck that, let's say, 30 years back, people who were writing of the material were not thinking of whatever had happened in India and other colonial countries as exceptional thing, or the colonial history as an exception. The other thing which is related to this is also that if you take Foucault, and certainly Foucault's idea of governmentality, one of the problems that I think Deana's material addresses, and therefore the question of pushing this framework a little further, is that by and large, Foucault's account of governmentality and by and large his theorization of the advent of liberalism is linked to a kind of formula style enunciation by him, which is namely that before liberalism, the power of the sovereign and the legitimacy of the sovereign depended on the capacity to inflict debts. And as liberalism proceeded, it changed, and the sovereign's legitimacy depended on its capacity to save lives. And I think partly because probably Foucault was not so much concerned with the colonial history, or possibly he was dealing with the European material in its own specific way, which we all know of. The combination of the capacity to inflict death is directly related, or it's a combination with your duty to save lives. And how much lives do you save? How much legal you make your regime? How orderly you are going to make your rule? How orderly you are going to run your society would depend on your capacity to arbitrate death. And there is, in some sense, a direct correlation between the progress of liberalism and the strength of the colonial ways of rule. Now, that is my main submission. And therefore, when I was looking back at the material, or for that matter, the entire 19th century, 2-3 things very briefly can be pointed out, kind of a, as I said, a little extreme framework in which her material can be framed. One is that at one level, you may say that this is how constitutionalism proceeded. It was nothing exceptional. And if we take an example of, for example, example of Indian Evidence Act, and the Indian Evidence Act was directly related, and I tried to address the question of confession and admission of guilt, tried to make these two things separate. If you see the successive amendments to the Evidence Act, continuing up to our time as the current Indian state becomes busy with making UAPA sedition charges, pressing on sedition charges, disciplining people who are thought to be terrorists, etc. You can see that constitutionalism and rule of law and torture, they proceed simultaneously. And if one looks into the way in which the circulation of the modes of terrorizing people went on between, let us say, Ireland, India, Kenya, to name three of the colonies of Ireland included, you can see that there is a general pattern that emerges, which is integrated with the way in which the home rule ran. And I know this is a bit controversial statement, and I wish that there is some discussion on that. But I shall only say that the mode of conscripting labor, the way plantation economy developed in the 19th century, early 20th century, I'm reminded of Bremen's work on taming the police, basically an account of torture in the plantation fields in Malaya. Other works, you can see that political economy, progress of liberalism, conscription of labor, and methods of torture, they're almost intermeshed with each other. So, Police Planet, I mean, to use a phrase, the way in which Police Planet has developed has nothing exceptional in it. This is inscribed in the way in which modern rule has developed globally. And I think the material that is presented in the book points to a much more general theory of the emergence of power, in a sense which inheres in it both the colonial and the liberal, including the way liberalism has functioned. Indeed, some of the revisionist histories, including works by several people, show that in as much as race was functioning as the fundamental fault line of a civilized society or a liberal society also, the link between the growth of constitutionalism and the growth of police forces, they depended on each other. And the fact, therefore, that you needed torture, among other means, to terrorize a society was also crucial in terms of how you rule the society. So therefore, if we are asked, I mean, this is my concluding thing, that Guantanamo Bay, is it an exception to the way the United States runs its own regime? My own submission would be no. It's a part of that. And if one looks closely at the way US prisons have worked, the way in which black population, the reference to that was indirectly made in the initial comments, they all show, and as I said, the revisionist histories are showing that indeed many of these methods were being used in England. Many of these methods were being used in France. In France, in fact, it was even more drastic. So the connection between liberalism and colonialism is deeper. And somehow or other, the moment you use this framework of exception, I think what we thereby, I'm not saying we are ignoring, but we are pushing to the margins, or we are minimizing the importance of the inherent presence of colonial modes, which still survive in India, which are still very much in India, in the way in which liberalism would develop and constitutionalism would develop. So that is where my own feeling is that the material can be maybe included or incorporated in a somewhat, yet with a little more extremist framework. But that is what I was thinking when I was reading the book. And thanks very much to Deana for writing this. And it's a great reading and learning experience. Thank you.
Thank you to both Steve and Ranabir for that thoughtful feedback. And Ranabir, I have to say, we've never met before. And I asked you to do this because I read some work of yours that really, really pushed my own ideas. And I thought you'd help me to push them further. And you have with those comments. So many thanks for that. So I'll try to respond to each of those points. So Steve, you asked, at what point did something become torture, and what do we perpetuate by describing it as something as torture? Huge question. and along the way in raising this, you raised the point, where is torture in the book? And It's a good question. Actually, one of the a colleague whom I asked to read the book said the same thing. Where are all the torture cases? I refer to only a few in any detail. That was a conscious choice, and maybe it was a conscious choice I should have spelled out in the introduction. For a number of reasons. One, as you yourself pointed out, the book is about terror. So I was less interested in the mechanics of torture and how it works. I think, you know, scholars like Darius Rajali have written volumes, you know, literally he's got an 800-page book on all the methods of torture, and what he's got 2 books actually, one of which is what constitutes pre-modern torture, what constitutes modern torture. And for me, those particular questions weren't particularly pressing, although Ranavir suggests that maybe they were. So it's more for me torture as a tool that I'm interested in. But nonetheless, there are issues when something becomes torture. I mean, there could be a whole book on that, right? Because this is what certainly the British were obsessed with. So their constant refrain was that, no, this isn't torture, this is just maltreatment. This is, and in fact, the only torture cases that survive anywhere in any archives that I've looked at are the ones that were so extreme, usually someone died, right? Or that was so extreme, or in a rare case, maybe the victim was upper caste, there was rape, there was, you know, horrific acts took place. In other words, when the cases became a scandal. So for the British, that could be identified as torture, and they were quite, they wouldn't beat around the bush with those cases. It was torture. Other things, other forms of violence were less clear. Of course, there's no sign of anything like the sorts of issues that I look at in the 4th chapter, that they're, you know, we can talk about mental violence, physical, you know, there's different forms of violence that can be, that we now consider torture. What I think is significant, though, is your point that we use this word torture, and I find it very problematic. Again, I don't talk about this in the book because I have written about it elsewhere, that what torture does, what that word does, there's a lot of concern. Is it now too copious because there's so many things that can be deemed torture? My son once accused me of colonial torture when I asked him to clean up his room. So, right, so we can get too broad in our definitions, but what I think a danger of the term is that it can obscure. So when something is labeled torture, then the question is, but what is taking place, right? So I do look at that issue, and I do talk briefly in the book about sexual violence, for example, because that was ubiquitous with torture. So for me, something significant was taking place if sexual violence, and this is against men as well as women. And in fact, it's largely only the cases against men that are documented. Because as I've argued in another article, this is because torture wasn't something, sexual violence wasn't seen as something that could be done to men, and so it's documented. The colonial regime wanted no hint whatsoever that its police forces were violating women. So that's, I've just written, I've got a forthcoming article on that was sedulously excluded from the archive, the idea that the police raped or could rape. So I think there are challenges in using that term. I would agree with you there. and this issue of when something becomes torture. I mean, there is a body of scholarship that says it's when the victim says it's torture. So I think I would agree with that, that take on torture. Why no chapter on victims? Run out of steam for one thing. You know, the book's already 140,000 words long. So, but there's two answers to that, actually, 2 more serious answers. One is because, again, the book, I was interested in documenting the violence of the colonial regime, and how it justified that, right? So the tool that torture served, what function did that serve? And that was my main concern. But a second reason is, after 10 years of working on torture and other forms of violence, I'm still very, very uncomfortable with dealing with the victims and thinking through how to negotiate violence on bodies. and what to document and what to say. I've just, as I said, this article that I have in press now that deals with the rape of a mother and daughter. It's the one single case I've ever come across in which the victim spoke, right? And she actually said before she committed suicide, kisi karun ke na rahe. She said that essentially that this was interpreted that she had lost her honor. She and her daughter had lost their honor, and this was the only way that it was interpreted, that she had been raped, and that was part of a 3-day ordeal of police torture. And that was the only case I felt comfortable actually looking at this issue of the victim. The victim had a voice there. I could give some agency to the victim. But I'm very, very conscious of the work of scholars of slavery like Sadia Hartman, Marissa Fuentes, who talk about the violence in which subaltern lives are enmeshed, and that we can, in recovering these or trying to document the experiences of torture victims, I only have individuals who are completely encased in the language of violence. So how you extract them from that, big questions. And I would have to say I'm still wrestling with them. But I planned halfway through this book that there would be a follow-up, which I've started work on, and that is on one torture case that took place in 1909 involving a woman who I believe was raped and who died, and it was a huge case for the colonial roots. I intend to interrogate all that there. So in other words, the victims is the follow-up. Can we psychoanalyze colonial subject? Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I did my best in that 4th chapter on the perpetrators. Yeah, you're right, Foucault gets us nowhere there. I did, I'm sure you saw in the bibliography, thank you for your kind comments about the extensive footnotes. I did, read voluminously on issues to do with psychoanalysis and trauma and all these things in terms of thinking about how we make sense of what makes people to act. I even, for the British, went into things like toilet training in the 19th century. Like, what is it that makes British men not see sexual violence against Indian men? Literally not, it's not visible to them. And I think there's something in there about their own schooling and education, and even there's a whole book on corporal punishment and toilet training that was written in the 1970s that I found very, very thought-provoking. So yes, there is much more that we can do to go down that road, and for me that is still also an ongoing journey. I did do one small piece for the ISRF bulletin on can we talk about colonial trauma or post-colonial trauma? Can we trace that? And very, very, very hard, I think, is for historians to do that. In terms of Ranabir's point, yeah, I love that point. You got me thinking as you were talking, Ranabir, about, in fact, Darius Rajali's work. So I don't know if you've seen this massive tome, 800-page book that he wrote on torture and democracy. Also, Ginny Lokanita's wonderful 2 books on torture in contemporary India. And she's also written a book comparing, that sort of violence in India to the United States, that both of them argue that torture is inherent to democracy. So this idea that it's something that was purged, this is obviously something I also challenge in Colonial Terror, the idea that torture is something we don't do anymore because we're British, right? Which is something the British like to say. We had a time when we did that. Of course, the Europeans were much worse, and we don't do that anymore because we're civilized and etc. And this is definitely all tied to liberal frameworks. And so your question is, I suppose I got out of that, well, what is colonial about this? Is it not an aspect of the development of liberal democracies? Yes and no. I mean, as you absolutely point out, we can trace this elsewhere, right? And Chris at the beginning talked about the Chauvin case. So certain groups of people, largely racial minorities in particular in liberal democracies in the West, have been subject to the same sorts of treatment. So I suppose, were I to push the argument further and to take the next step, which you're suggesting, we could then, and I think I don't tie this in sufficiently perhaps with developments in Britain in that sense, in terms of political developments. But for me, this is enacting a regime of torture is a constitutive part of Western democracies, right? It is a constitutive part of the development of the liberal state in Britain and so on. I suppose we have to think more clearly about the integration of those various systems and how they were shaped. What I tried to focus on in the book is the issue of denial, which I think hasn't had enough historical attention or attention by historians, but the ways in which the fact that it is constitutive, the fact that it is distinctly British to torture racial others, right? And we know that this was done not just in India, but in many other contexts. We know that it's done to some extent here in Britain as well, and it's been done in other Western democracies and so on. But that is always denied. And for me, this is the frustrating aspect of it. We don't do that with British. Even I opened the book with recent decades, half a century or more, for victims of colonial torture in the most egregious examples, places like Kenya, Cyprus, and so on, to have their cases heard in Britain. There are cases finally being heard, cases being won. But the narrative always is, we didn't do that, you did that. That was, that idea that the atavistic other constantly is the one perpetuating these practices, that violence is not central to the liberal democratic state. And that's what needs to be tackled. And so, yes, they are connective, and that colonial context is constitutive, right? It is what makes British exceptionalism, or we could look at other contexts, American exceptionalism and so on, possible. Right? We don't do that. That's what these other atavistic people do. And in fact, we went there and we tried to put a stop to it, and we couldn't do that because they're just so atavistic. So, yeah, I would largely agree with you there. And I'll stop and wait for any other questions.
Great, thanks, Deana. So we'll open it up, and I will read the questions more or less in the order in which they appeared. So this is from Rosemary Yates. Did you find that the colonial rulers used torture as a means of inspiring a generalized fear of offending colonial authorities, and thus prompting the compliance and continuing subordination of the indigenous people? Or did you establish, on the other hand, that torture was applied with more targeted and specific purposes, such as identifying malcontents, Indian nationalists, and resistors, whether active or passive? So the larger versus more specific.
Okay. So what I argue in the book is that torture was very specific. So for the most part, it was used by the police to extract information. So it was very targeted. It was targeted largely at subalterns. So really the lowest, the poorest of the poor, the most marginal members of Indian society, and it was enacted by those same groups. They were the ones, the lowest rungs of the Indian police, who themselves, I argue in the book, were the victims of colonial violence themselves, of other forms. These semi-starved, extremely impoverished lower rungs of the Indian police enacting torture, partly for their own benefit, to advance their situation vis-a-vis local elite, and partly for that of the colonial regime, because they were rewarded for such action. So it was particular, but in terms of terror, what I argue is that seemingly the British wanted to abolish torture. And so it's not just the Madras Torture Commission that you see these efforts to do that, but really from the late 18th century, torture in India becomes something that's talked about, that is seen as a problem. Edmund Burke raised this in the late 18th century, that this was an aspect of British rule in India. That narrative changes, that it becomes then something aberrant that the British are trying to drive out. The fact that they're constantly talking about it and obsessed with it and seemingly constantly trying to eradicate it, but actually don't. And what I explore in the book is how they never eradicate it because they never want to eradicate it. There are simple things they could do to solve most of the problems in relation to torture, but they don't, because it served a useful function. And you even see this in colonial reports, you know, this idea that the Indian police are a source of terror. And on the one hand, you see, yeah, that's not good. And on the other hand, there's a, yeah, we need that. We need our police forces to serve that function. And it served the British in multiple ways. One, because they could displace blame for their own constitutive violence on to essentially their own victims. They're the fault. We're here trying to civilize them and stop them from doing this. And it also served the function of, quelling the Indian population. You know, the average villager was scared to death of the Indian police. So it served a very useful function to them, but it was a fine balancing act, because there's the danger that your violence workers can overstep what you want them to do. So I also look in the book at the ways in which they had to be disciplined to keep them within certain boundaries that the state could use them. And so there's this juggling act that goes on the whole time, really from about the early 19th century. It continues. I just end the book in the early 20th century. So, but that juggling act was something that the British really struggled to maintain, and one reason they were so obsessed with torture. How do we maintain the function of the police as violence workers without having them serve as a danger to us?
Thanks, Deana. The next is a comment that invites you to make some connections, I think, to the current situation, and it probably pushes you back more towards option one of the last question around sort of general constitutivity, as opposed to managing specific issues with violence. The foundational basis of India's police functioning continues to be colonial law. Custodial violence is torture and continues to be a huge problem, and police reforms are very far away. Someone who opposes the state or are from vulnerable groups remain the main targets. So I guess the question there is whether is the colonial situation that you're describing as historical and still very contemporary in terms of the logic and the structure that we're talking about?
I think the short answer to that is yes.
Yes. Okay. Onward.
There's voluminous scholarship on. I agree with it. There's voluminous scholarship on the holdovers of colonial policing and what the post-colonial Indian state decided to retain and what it decided to reform. And it's well known that policing was not something it sought to reform. Again, there's been benefit in that terrorizing function of the Indian police for the post-colonial Indian state. If there wasn't, something would surely have been done about it, right? It's really striking, though, since this is a contemporary question, looking at the global responses to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, how many former British colonies responded to those protests. And there were comparable protests, in different parts of Africa, for example, in particular, responding, Kenya, Ghana, Zimbabwe, many places, with their own movements responding to that. India, deathly silence, right? Barring, there are activists who work on, but no mass kind of uprising against the Indian police. And that's because, of course, there's been buy-in, right? Because the police victimize those segments of the population that the upper caste, more well-to-do segments of the population find problematic. And so, you know, in that sense, not a lot has changed.
That question was from Sanjoy Hazarika, and this one is from David Leiveld. How were acts of torture and terror, both English words, perceived, condemned, and resisted by victims and other Indians in the period covered in the book? What are words used in Indian languages, and how do they fit into Indian concepts of governmentality?
Tough question. Really tough question. Because, I mean, let's face it, colonial regimes have no stake in documenting their own violence, right? Or the effect of that violence on the victims of it. So huge reams, I think, of records in relation to torture have been destroyed. If you work on colonial India, you'll know that only the material that was deemed of interest to the British state was sent back to Britain. And they had all these ranked series, and other, you know, say B series, for example, never left the archives in India. They stayed there. They were never sent back to Britain. So that only bits remain. And I got the sense, it's something I've thought about writing about. We don't talk enough about what's in archives and what isn't in archives. I got the sense through doing research for this book that there's an awful lot missing, and that there have been successive purges. And we know that there was a big burning when the British left India. So I have no idea what was destroyed. Of the bits that do remain, as I said, it's always these sensational cases, usually that ended in death. You know, the voices of the victims are not there. There's very little of the experience of them. All of the existing documentation that remains that I've seen in any case is in English. And so this adds to Steve's point about the difficulties of making sense of the experience of victims. And as I said, I've only just now tackled it. I've tackled it in 2 articles. But even then, in terms of the use of concepts of torture, I get the sense that it's there, unless we're talking about sexual violence. So as I said, there's this really problematic slippage in which sexual violence is always in these records subsumed under torture. And yet for the victims, certainly female victims, the sexual violence is what they would refer to, right? In the rare instances in which they would talk about this, not other aspects of torture that clearly they were subject to. So these are really, really complex questions that I'm hoping to look at more in the next project.
Yeah, Deana, the next one is actually a continuation of this, the discussion you've just started. And I think it's also, it could be construed as an invitation to talk about your chapter 4. It's from Stephen Becker, who says, as a non-academic with an interest in colonialism and imperialism and the role of the British ruling class, I think it is important to describe the methods of torture violence and link this with the views expressed by the torturers and their rationalizations. The colonial period has been sanitized in something avuncular, some avuncular benign period, and this whitewashed version of history is peddled by our own politicians. Certainly true. So yeah, that linkage is something that you broach. You want to say another word about that?
So the difficulty there is that, as I mentioned earlier, in 99.9% of the cases, the torture itself was carried out by these subordinate members of the Indian police. I do have evidence of largely lower ranking British police officers involved in torture or sanctioning torture, or clearly the chain of command goes up to them. So there's evidence that they were definitely complicit, more than just facilitating, but actively complicit. So it's very difficult then. I have a few cases in which British officers, as I said, were clearly behind everything. So you could, in those cases, document the types of torture taking place. Although still, those officers wouldn't dirty their hands. It's something their subordinates would do, and they use tried and tested methods that were particular to India. But as I've mentioned, the sorts of things that Darius Rajali talks about in his work, for example, on pre-modern Iran. So, yeah, I mean, talking about the torture techniques, as I've already mentioned, is problematic. It's important for documenting, I suppose, the nature of the brutality, but it raises other problems in terms, particularly when you're thinking about the victims. And that's something I mentioned actually at the beginning of the book when looking at the example of torture victims from Kenya who, you know, 60 years after the fact are finally getting some sort of justice for the torture to which they was, if you can even call the things that they went through after 60 years, getting a few £1,000s justice. Where did I go with that? I forgot what I was going to say now, but there's some acknowledgement there that, or some recognition of the brutality of these torture tactics. And these victims then they have their own voices in which they can articulate what happened to them. And, you know, which in the colonial case, as I said, I'm still wrestling with those issues as to how to do that effectively and fairly.
Deana, we have a wave of questions and we're getting to 10 after the hour. So I'm going to ask these next, a pair together. This is from Rabia Aslam. With respect to the ubiquitousness of torture, are you saying we also need to think about an empire of torture? And then there's an interesting add-on to this. Could it be that subjective? It's an inner difficulty, as Alessandro Vivaldo would say, that's being connected there. And then the second in this pair is from Manjit Ramgotra. This might seem a banal comment, but your discussion on how the British and civilized people don't do torture makes me think of John Stuart Mill's harm principle and how this defines the limits of liberty. Therefore, modern civilized and free peoples do not harm and or torture others. So my question is, have you thought of torture in terms of this British liberal idea of harm?
I'm not sure I quite got the second question there, Chris.
Start on the first and we can come back to it. Okay.
I love Rabia's question about an empire of torture. I used the term empire of pain in the book, which I take from J.M. Coetzee, which he uses in one of his works of fiction. Yeah, absolutely. You could talk about that, and I'm sure if we joined the dots, I think one of the challenges with this type of ubiquitous, and we could say banal violence, banal because it is so ubiquitous, is that as I've mentioned in relation to how scholars have approached colonial violence, focusing on the most visible forms, it's this less visible type of violence that hasn't attracted enough attention. So there is work on torture, but only in those extreme cases, say, of British counterinsurgency operations, a term I don't like because it legitimates the state brutality. But the sort of everyday ubiquity of torture across the colonial world hasn't received attention, or the myriad other forms of violence that structured people's daily lives. So yes, I think Empire of Torture, that's a great title for a book. thank you for the suggestion about Mill and the liberal idea of harm. No, I didn't think of looking at the concept of harm. I focused a great deal on pain and how pain was understood, and the idea that pain had been eradicated. But there's also a really interesting scholarship that focuses particularly around the abolition of slavery, the attempts to abolish slavery, and then the aftermath, that looks at the relationship between pain and pornography. So and it's interesting, and this fascinated me because my earlier work was on obscenity and pornography and so on, but that the idea of pain or degrees of pain, certainly newer modern notions of pain, emerged in conjunction with the modern forms of pornography. So there's a lot that's interesting there. But the idea of harm in particular is not a concept that I worked with, but thanks, I will do for the next project.
Thanks, Deana. Okay, the next pair. The first is from Abnuha Anushri. I'm wondering what is at stake in distinguishing between torture and violence. Why not just use the word violence instead of torture? What strikes me in the word torture is, unlike the term violence, is its directionality. Violence is scalar, torture is not. However, as works of anthropologists like Veena Das amply show, directionality of torture does not necessarily mean its linearity. Does your use of the term complicate the story of colonial torture in terms of looking at different agencies and actors involved in acts of torture? Yeah, well, I'll stop there and then do the second. Go ahead.
Okay. I think if you use the term violence instead of torture, you've got an even bigger problem, don't you? Because the concept of violence is just incredibly copious, right? And I teach a module on this, on the history of violence, and so we grapple every single time with what do we mean by violence, and it ends up getting so huge. You know, there's an anthropologist who's written a wonderful article on the violence of oversubscribed time, and as a British academic, it's something that I feel I've been inflicted with a great deal. So that term itself has become copious. So while I would agree that the term torture is equally problematic as any all-encompassing term is, I do work hard in the book to say that all torture is not synonymous, and that the types of pain inflicted and who they're by are issues that we need to pay attention to, because only when we do that can we understand the rationale of the torturers themselves, right? So I look at this when I talk about the perpetrators of torture. So it is very important, and that's one reason for me that I've singled out sexual violence as something that really needs attention, because that is the one form of torture that was really, really ubiquitous, and it just crops up again and again and virtually all of the torture cases I've got, and I must have 60 or more of them. That is the one. And the only time that I've not seen that used is on the rare cases the victims were higher caste. So this was, you know, and it played an important role of shaming, and it extends to group dynamics. So the idea is that if you inflict sexual violence on an individual, that extends beyond the individual to the group, the caste, and so on. So I've looked a lot at what that particular form of violence, what function that is serving. But I'm sure there are others. Some of them just seem petty or wantonly cruel, you know, like making someone sit on an ant's nest, or putting various types of biting insects on them. That just seem, this is what you've got to hand, right? Nettles, suspending people, holding them over a fire, etc. Those sorts of things. That's what you've got to hand when you need to get information out. But sexual violence to me is doing something much bigger.
Okay, thanks, Deana. No, it's a good start. This next one is another about applications to the present. This is from Tanushree Sarkar. How can the fear of colonial terror be expelled from the minds of contemporary Indians? Because even today, we continue to be afraid of colonial terror.
I'm not quite sure how to respond to that question, because yeah, I'm not sure if you're saying that we're afraid of the legacies of that system, or the nature of British colonialism. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that one.
Well, why don't, if Tanushree, if you could follow up on the dimension that you're interested in, I will come back to this. This is from Gagan Singh. Did the emergence of legal medicine around mid-19th century transform the meaning of torture in India? Was there a shift? And if so, how do you see it?
I wouldn't say there was a shift. No, that's a great question, Gagan. Not a shift, but a legitimization. So, and I'm sure you've read a lot of these medical jurisprudence manuals, which of course start to appear in the mid-19th century. William Cheever's most notable, he writes voluminously about torture, that it is used to justify the sorts of arguments that the British, I claim, started making, that the Torture Commission is the beginning of this new sort of discourse that sought to completely absolve the British for any responsibility for the torture committed by their subjects, you know, serving them. And that the blame then becomes entirely displaced onto Indians, and there's a whole discourse about their irrationality, etc. The medical jurisprudence literature plays an important role in framing that discourse and substantiating those arguments. And it is cited in torture cases, right? And so the argument is, well, Indians just torture. I mean, they're brutal, they're barbaric, they're irrational, it's done. Cheever says, you know, fathers torture their sons, the husbands their wives. It's an aspect of Indian culture, hence what do you expect? You know, we're doing our best to get rid of it, but you know, that's the way they are. So yeah, I would agree. It's an important literature.
Okay, thanks, Deana. We're into our last 10 minutes here. Sanjoy Hazarika has a follow-up from a previous question. It's a bit of a yes or no. The point of my question was, do you think Britain carries a colonial legacy that it needs to apologize for in this regard? After all, 54 countries of the Commonwealth share these colonial laws.
And yes. So sorry, did I miss something again about what
no,
I'm being asked?
Yes is an appropriate answer.
Yes.
To apologize, that it needs to apologize for. I mean, there may be other things
I see.
Okay. Also do in addition to that. But I think
to me, the danger is this narrative that just will not go away, right? And that we're British and we don't do this. Right, and that the British Empire was a glorious sort of civilizing, beneficent thing. This is still the public discourse about empire in Britain, certainly under the current establishment. And so yes, that needs to be. It is so important for the contemporary moment that be challenged.
Okay, the next two. This is from Rabia. Oh wait, did I already do this? Yes, I did. No, it's Rabia Aslam again. Thank you for your considered and well-researched analysis about the voices of victims. Their silence says a lot. Have you come across any examples where they talk about who the police were and whether, say, reformed criminals were recruited? Also, is there much which alludes to their humanity? And then let me just throw in the second question here. This is from Santana Kanikar. I mean, this is an interesting challenge to those of us who favor systemic over sort of more individual case analysis. Did the fact that blame was always placed on a few bad apples, mostly Indian, help in some ways the possibilities of resistance by using the language of reform, care, and rights? What happens when this official rejection does not happen?
Huh. That's a great question, Santana. Okay, so in the fourth chapter of the book, in which I look at the perpetrators, and by the way, I put them at the end. So most of the book looks at the rationales of what I call the facilitators, because to me, these are the ones that we really need to be looking at. When we talk about torture, we tend to focus on those who are actually doing it, usually men, usually a group of men. And for me, these men are at the end, the last thing that we should be looking at, the ones actually doing the torture, because they're not the ones that create the system that make it possible. So I do look at those, and I do consider the humanity of the police. For me, this is a big issue. Most of those doing the torture, and this does come out actually in many ways more effectively in the documents that have survived than is the case with victims. There is detail on the on those doing the torture. There is also a lot of voluminous information on the Indian police themselves in the colonial period. And as I've mentioned, the police themselves, the ones doing the torture, tended to be the most marginal members of Indian society, right? They were recruited from the lowest castes or Dalit castes. They were as I talk about in the book, kept so incredibly impoverished. I mean, point of starvation impoverished. And the colonial regime knew this. They knew that the only way those men could survive was through predation on the Indian populace, and they let that continue. They never paid them a living wage, for example. So for me, yes, the understanding the humanity of the torturers and restoring an element of their humanity was very important, and something that I actually found easier to do than in the case of the victims. The existing documentation makes that possible. In terms of Santana's questions, I like the idea about framing the issue of framing the problem of torture in India. This is always phrased in terms of bad apples, right? Look at the Chauvin case. He was just a bad apple. The Minneapolis police force is fine. It's just this guy who's a problem. In terms of shaping resistance to that narrative, which I think, Santana, is what you were suggesting. I mean, I don't know, this is in your terrain, I think, more than mine. It's certainly not something that I've looked at. And of course, it does start to happen, doesn't it, from the 1920s onwards. I cut the book off really during the course of the First World War, at the point at which torture essentially disappears from colonial documents. But you do, for example, start to get the beginning of police organization and them challenging the frameworks through which they have been, you know, that in which their behavior has been articulated and their status defined, etc. So I think there's possibly some interesting work that could be done there, and it probably more fruitfully also in the current era.
Yeah, I think the import of that is also that without these spectacular cases, it's very hard to mobilize movements, as the George Floyd killing shows. Because there's, you know, police killing is a systemic issue in the United States and most other places, and yet it was this one that really galvanized, and you know, in the way that Michael Brown, even in Ferguson, did not. So there's a utility to apples, if it allows them for the connection to the system. Yeah. Anyway.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sorry, I missed that sentence. You were probably referring to resistance against the police, but you're right, Chris. Yes, absolutely.
Last question, because we have 2 minutes left. This is from Rachel Zhu. Have the attitudes and responses of colonial rulers to torture changed over time and thus been historically specific? That is to say, framed by historically specific conditions of possibility. For example, how colonial rule is conceptualized and how this is related to conceptions of race. So it's a question about evolving, I guess, even in the period in which you're looking.
Yes. Yes, I would say. And that's why I start and end the book at two distinct moments. So I do kind of go into the early 19th century, but definitely the discourses are changing all along. And certainly we see one big shift in the 1850s. And that one really has surprising longevity. And I really don't think it's effectively challenged or replaced until the early 20th century. And then I think, and one of the reasons I ended the book there is because what precipitated major change in India was the nature of the victims. So what happens in the early 20th century, of course, with the colonial nationalist, anti-colonial nationalist movement is new types of victims. So what do you do when your victims are educated students or, you know, so-called bhadralok, respectable people, etc., in places like Calcutta versus out in the middle of nowhere in Punjab or whatever the case may be? That necessitated a new narrative and reconsidering letting torture run rampant, so to speak, because it was now a really big problem, particularly since in those early, as the British called them, conspiracy cases in the early 20th century, the British kept losing. and you know, the victims kept showing up with battered bodies and so on and saying, well, I was tortured in prison, and cases were getting thrown out. So definitely there are evolutions in these narratives over time.
We didn't get to everybody's questions, but we are out of time. I just want to invite the commentators to make a final comment if they are so inclined.
Yeah, just one line, in the sense that when I, raised the question of exception, all I wanted to say was that the exception looks kind of a very attractive framework when you look at it from the colony and the metropolitan relation. But on the other hand, if you see that precisely when the instruments of torture and the task of terrorizing a society or the imperative, it went on and still goes on hand in hand with the whole imperative that rule, trial, constitution, and bringing order into society is a public process. It cannot be a secret process. So exactly from the time that you start stabilizing a society through regulations, then successive acts, finally leading to the promulgation of a constitution of Republican India, you also have at the same time the imperative to confine people, to torture people not so publicly, to keep your findings below the carpet, and basically all other kinds of things that you do so that these things do not go public. So the division between what is to be public, so the trial has to be public, the deliberations have to be public, and what you have to confine, what you have to keep away from public eye, is something that is inherent in the way in which the liberal rule will develop. And therefore, this way, the entire 19th century, that's why what seems to be a paradox is not a paradox, because that's the way the public rule, the public law, the rule of law, all those things proceed. So when I say that perhaps we need to, much more interrogate, much more deeply, and probably a little more, how would I say, mercilessly, into what appears to be exception, what appears to be a paradox, is needed. It's the call of the hour.
All right. I want to apologize to the folks whose questions we didn't get to. They will be forwarded to Deana, so they will not be just disappearing into the ether. I want to thank everybody tonight for participation, and also to the participants in the other launches for coming in this very difficult year. I mean, I personally think that we can take comfort in the powers of the intelligence that has been brought to bear on the crises we analyze, both by the ISRF Fellows and by folks all over the world, even as the crises are extremely difficult to bear. So thank you again for being here this afternoon, and we'll see you in September.
Thank you for joining us. For ISRF updates and information about future events, please sign up to our mailing list at www.isrf.org/mailing list. See you again soon. Goodbye.